It was a quiet April morning in 1990 when the news passed through wires and papers. Greta Garbo was gone. She had slipped away in New York, as silently as she had lived for decades. No final performance, no last curtain call, only a quiet departure befitting the mystery she had always guarded. The world, which once leaned forward in darkened cinemas to watch the haunting light of her face, was left again to wonder who she had truly been. Welcome, dear listener. Before we begin, I invite you to share in the comments when and where you are listening, so we may weave together a small network of memory across time. And if you wish to support the continuation of this channel, Timeless History Documents, do press the subscribe button so our wandering through the shadows of history may continue. She was born in Stockholm in 1905, under a sky that often wore a veil of gray. The streets of Södermalm, her neighborhood, were narrow and filled with the smell of coal smoke, wet stone, and the sharp scent of laundry steaming from basements. Her name at birth was Greta Lovisa Gustafsson, a name plain, sturdy, and shaped by working-class Sweden. It is easy to imagine the winters of her childhood, the crunch of snow beneath wooden shoes, the sting of cold air on the skin, the way children huddled near the small stoves of their apartments, tracing figures in frost on the window glass. Her father was a laborer, her mother a laundress. They lived without extravagance, and every coin mattered. Greta was the youngest of 3 children, and she was quiet from the beginning. While other children played loudly in the streets, she preferred corners, doorways, the quiet shadow where she might observe without being seen. Yet she was not without imagination. She invented worlds while scrubbing clothes beside her mother. She rehearsed lines of conversations she would never say aloud, and she carried, even as a girl, the faint impression of one set apart. Perhaps it was poverty that pressed her into silence, or perhaps it was something more inward, a natural reserve that would one day become her greatest strength. Her father died when she was only 14. The grief was heavy, yet practical needs pressed harder. The family had no luxury to sink into mourning. Greta left school and began to work in a barber shop, first cleaning, then tending to small tasks. She was tall, strong in stature, with broad features that seemed too serious for her age. Customers remarked on her presence, though she did not speak much. Later, she worked in a department store, and it was there, in the hum of customers, the smell of fabrics and perfumes, that she was asked to appear in an advertising short film for hats. It was an unremarkable production, a flicker of seconds on screen, yet it lit something within her. In those years, cinema was still a new and wondrous invention. The flicker of silent images projected in theaters drew both working people and the wealthy into the same darkened rooms. For Greta, who had known little beyond the crowded apartments and damp alleys of Södermalm, the possibility of existing in that shimmering world must have felt like a glimpse of another life. She began to dream, not in bold declarations, but in secret thoughts carried with her while folding linens or sweeping floors. Could she, one day, belong to that world? Her entry into acting did not come easily. She had no connections, no wealth, no family of artists to guide her path. What she possessed was a gaze, a quiet intensity that unsettled those who looked too long into her eyes. She applied to the Royal Dramatic Theatre's acting school in Stockholm and was accepted. It was here, in dim rehearsal rooms that smelled of dust and old costumes, that she began to shape the fragments of her inner world into something that could be projected outward. She was still shy, often avoiding the chatter of fellow students, yet when she stepped into character, her silence became weight. Teachers noticed. Her instructors described her as enigmatic, as though she carried within her some hidden flame she was unwilling to share, except in the moment of performance. It was during this time that she crossed paths with Mauritz Stiller, a film director of great influence in Sweden. He saw in her what few others had yet perceived, a star not built from chatter and charm, but from silence and presence. Stiller, demanding and visionary, became both mentor and sculptor of her image. He guided her toward roles that highlighted her stillness, her eyes, her sense of distance. He insisted she change her name. Gustafsson was too plain, too tied to the narrow streets of Södermalm. Garbo was chosen, a name with sharper edges, carrying mystery even when spoken aloud. Greta Garbo was born, not in a cradle of privilege, but in the rough shaping hands of chance and a director's ambition. One can imagine the girl she had been, sitting in the dim light of her childhood room, hearing her father cough in the night, feeling the chill air through thin walls, now stepping into another skin altogether. Did she ever pause to consider what was being lost, even as something else was gained? She was no longer merely Greta, the laundress's daughter. She was now a creation, a name, a face soon to be carried across continents. In these early Swedish films, Garbo's features seemed both plain and extraordinary. Her face was strong, not fragile, her gaze direct, though her manner hesitant. The camera lingered on her eyes, and it was as though they carried stories unspoken. Audiences leaned forward, unsettled by the impression that this woman on screen was both fully present and entirely unknowable. But the true leap was yet to come. Stiller, convinced of her potential, arranged for her to travel to Germany, where film industries were flourishing in the 1920s. There she was exposed to the grand studios of Berlin, the avant-garde movements, the restless creativity of a continent between wars. The scents changed, no longer laundry steam and coal smoke, but the perfume of cafes, the tang of beer halls, the smoke of endless cigarettes curling in artistic gatherings. Garbo, still young, absorbed it all in silence, watching more than she spoke. And then came the call from across the ocean. Hollywood, hungry for fresh faces, new mysteries beckoned. For a girl born among the narrow streets of Södermalm, the very idea must have seemed impossible. Yet Stiller insisted. He would take her with him. She would become a star not only in Sweden, not only in Germany, but in the vast, glittering machine of America. What must she have felt preparing to leave? The taste of salt air on the journey, the sound of waves against the ship, the sense of being carried not only from one shore to another, but from one life into an entirely new existence. Did she mourn the streets of her childhood? Did she imagine she would never truly return? These questions remain unanswered, like so much of her life. And so the girl of Södermalm, who once folded linens beside her mother, who once sat in silence in the back of a classroom, sailed into a destiny none could have foreseen. The sea carried her westward, to a land of light and shadow, where mystery itself would become her mask and silence her most powerful voice. The ship's horn echoed across the water, and with it the closing of one chapter of life, the opening of another. The ship's horn still seemed to echo in her ears when she first set foot on American soil, though the noise of New York Harbor soon drowned it out. The air was different here, heavier, mixed with the scent of salt, oil, and the faint sweetness of fruit unloaded from distant places. Greta, who had barely traveled outside Sweden before, now found herself watching the restless dance of immigrants, sailors, and merchants, their voices rising in 100 languages. She kept her silence, her gaze fixed not on the chaos of the port but on the horizon, as if she were already thinking beyond this first arrival. America was not her true destination. Hollywood waited. Far to the west, Mauritz Stiller was at her side, carrying both ambition and restlessness in his stride. He had insisted she accompany him, convinced that the studios in California would be the ground where her peculiar talent might take root. Stiller believed in her more fiercely than she could believe in herself. He spoke to agents, pressed contracts, demanded attention. Greta remained quiet in these dealings, her heavy Swedish accent and careful English still halting. She let her silence stand where others might have filled the air with promises. In time, That very silence would be mistaken for arrogance, for disdain, yet in truth it was little more than shyness, wrapped in watchfulness. The journey westward by train was long, and as days passed, she looked out upon endless landscapes. The forests of the east gave way to the wide plains, the mountains, the desert stretching toward the sea. She was 20 years old, yet still carried herself like someone much older, with a kind of seriousness that the American public would soon find both unsettling and magnetic. When at last the train pulled into Los Angeles, she must have felt the shift in the air, dry, perfumed by citrus groves, touched with gasoline fumes from the automobiles that already filled the streets. The city had grown from a sleepy town into a restless empire of dreams, built on light, cameras, and the strange hunger of those who sought to be seen. The studio that first welcomed her was Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, a kingdom ruled by men who measured beauty like currency. Executives glanced at her skeptically. She was not the conventional American type of star. Her cheekbones were sharp, her expression reserved, her body tall and strong rather than delicate. They wondered whether audiences could love such a face. But they remembered Stiller's insistence, his certainty that her silence was not a flaw, but a gift. They agreed to test her. Those early days in Hollywood must have been filled with strangeness for her. The sets were enormous, filled with painted backdrops and heavy lights. The crews were loud, always moving, always shouting orders. Greta learned to move among them with stillness. While others laughed, gossiped, or displayed their charm, she held herself apart, answering only when necessary, keeping her thoughts hidden. Yet when the cameras turned toward her, something changed. She no longer seemed shy. Her eyes absorbed the light, her movements slow but decisive, her silence becoming a kind of music that could be read across the screen. Her first American film, Torrent in 1926, was a test, yet audiences noticed her. The second, The Temptress, revealed more. Though she spoke no words, silent films still ruled. The impression she left was stronger than dialogue. Viewers leaned forward in darkened theaters, watching the curve of her mouth, the way she seemed to carry both desire and sadness in a single glance. Hollywood, quick to sense a shift, began to promote her not as an ordinary starlet, but as something other, something elusive. They printed her face on posters. They whispered of her mystery. But behind the bright posters was a more complicated reality. Greta was far from comfortable in this new world. The American language came slowly to her. At gatherings, she often sat silent, unable to follow the rapid conversation, unwilling to stumble over foreign words. Her accent was thick, her phrases careful, and she feared the judgment of others. To avoid humiliation, she withdrew. She declined invitations, avoided parties, and left the public to believe she was aloof. Already the myth of Garbo the recluse was beginning to form, though in truth it was the vulnerability of a young woman lost in a land not her own. Mauritz Stiller, who had brought her here, soon found himself at odds with the studio. His demands were too great, his methods too harsh, and he was eventually dismissed. Greta was left to navigate the machinery of Hollywood without his guiding hand. Though she missed his presence, she also began to find her own ground. The studio, cautious at first, now saw her value. They invested in her, refining her image, dressing her in silks and jewels, capturing her in endless portraits. She was asked to smile, but her smiles were brief, rare, and often tinged with melancholy. It was as though she instinctively resisted the glitter that others embraced. The press, eager to describe every new star, searched for a way to explain her. They called her the Swedish Sphinx, a woman whose face revealed nothing, whose silence seemed deliberate. Yet for audiences, this very quality was alluring. In a world that often demanded women to charm, to chatter, to laugh on command, Greta's reserve was a mystery they could not look away from, and as her fame grew, so too did her solitude. She wrote letters home to her mother and siblings, though rarely in detail. She missed the streets of Stockholm, the sound of Swedish spoken naturally, the comfort of her own language. In Hollywood, she felt herself drifting between two selves, the Greta who longed for the quiet of her childhood home, and the Garbo who appeared on screens, larger than life, the subject of endless fascination. Did she ever reconcile the two? Or did she forever feel that a part of her had been left behind in the cold streets of Södermalm, waiting for her return? Her breakthrough came with Flesh and the Devil in 1926, where she starred opposite John Gilbert. The chemistry between them, both on and off the screen, ignited rumors that spread quickly. Audiences were entranced, yet what mattered most was the way she appeared on film. Luminous, haunting, more real than any actress before her. The silent screen, which could so easily flatten human presence into pantomime, seemed to deepen when her face appeared. She had a way of being still, of letting her thoughts show through her eyes, that drew audiences into her inner life without words, and so Hollywood began to build its myth. Greta Garbo, the mysterious foreigner, the woman who spoke little, who smiled rarely, whose face seemed carved from marble yet filled with secret fire. She was different, and difference itself was now the source of her power. But beneath the image, the young woman still wrestled with shyness, with loneliness, with the weight of a destiny she had not entirely chosen. At night, after the lights of the studio faded, she returned to her apartment and sat in silence, her thoughts circling around questions she never spoke aloud. Was this truly her life now? Was the girl from Södermalm lost forever? The applause of audiences was loud, but in her own rooms the only sound was the faint hum of the city outside. The faint hum of the city outside her window carried her into restless nights, yet in those same hours she often thought of the man who had first believed in her. Mauritz Stiller's shadow still lingered, stretching across the ocean and into every corner of her new world. He had been her protector, her mentor, the one who had seen her not as a timid girl but as a figure who could command the screen. Without him, she felt both untethered and strangely free, for his control had always been heavy, almost suffocating. He had sculpted her name, guided her posture, demanded her obedience to his vision. And though he was absent now, she carried the weight of his influence as though it were still pressing against her shoulders. Stiller's career faltered after his clashes with MGM, and he returned to Europe, leaving Garbo to face Hollywood's machinery alone. Their separation was not only professional, but personal, for in some unspoken way she had leaned upon him as a surrogate father, a guide, and perhaps even as a figure of impossible affection. She never spoke of him directly in later years, and the silence around his name seemed to echo her discomfort with what had passed between them. Was it gratitude she felt? Resentment? A quiet grief? Such questions float unanswered in the silence she left behind, yet Hollywood did not allow her the luxury of reflection. With each film, her presence grew, and so too did the demands upon her. She was dressed in costumes that shimmered under the harsh lights, her face powdered, her hair shaped into styles that suited the fashions of the day. Behind the cameras, directors and producers debated how to present her. Some saw her as exotic, others as tragic, some as sensual. She resisted all labels, yet she knew that her power lay not in defiance, but in yielding to the lens. Before the camera, she offered herself not through words, but through stillness, her gaze holding layers of unspoken thought. It was in Flesh and the Devil that the course of her life shifted once more, not only for her career, but for her heart. Opposite her played John Gilbert, a star already adored by audiences for his charm and intensity. The camera captured the fire between them, and the world believed it was more than performance. Off-screen, they indeed drew close, and whispers spread through the studio lots and beyond. For a time, it seemed as though Garbo had found a companion who could match her intensity. Gilbert was known for his passion, his impulsiveness, and his need for affection, qualities that both attracted and unsettled her. Their relationship became one of the great Hollywood romances, though it was woven with contradictions. Gilbert desired marriage, a union that would formalize their bond, but Garbo hesitated. The very thought of such permanence seemed to weigh upon her spirit. She lived in a world of hesitation, of retreat, and the institution of marriage felt like a cage, even when gilded with love. She delayed, she resisted, and though Gilbert pressed, she never surrendered. Some accounts claim she abandoned him at the altar, though whether this is truth or invention remains uncertain. What is clear is that her refusal broke his heart, and their love, once bright, dissolved into distance. In this moment, we see a pattern that would shape her life again and again. Garbo drew people toward her with the force of her presence, yet when intimacy threatened to close too tightly around her, she pulled away. To the public, this seemed mysterious, almost cruel, but perhaps it was simply the nature of a soul that needed vast spaces of solitude. Could she have given herself to another without losing the fragile balance that allowed her to exist on screen as she did? Or was she doomed always to choose solitude over closeness, silence over confession? As her fame spread, so too did the myth of her aloofness. Reporters clamored for interviews, but she declined. Photographers sought candid shots, but she hid from them. Studio executives begged her to attend public events, but she withdrew. What began as shyness soon became a deliberate stance. She seemed to understand that mystery was a currency more powerful than publicity. While other stars filled magazines with their chatter, Garbo filled them with absence. And in that absence, audiences projected their own fantasies, their own desires. She became not only a woman, but a canvas upon which the world painted its imaginings. Still, this deliberate retreat did not shield her from loneliness. Letters from Sweden reminded her of the families she rarely saw, and though she sent money to support them, she did not return often. Her life was now bound to Hollywood, a land that never truly felt like home. She walked through its orange groves and crowded boulevards as though she were passing through a dream, her real self hidden beneath layers of silence. In these years, she began to craft her identity as something separate from the machinery of the studio. She chose her roles carefully, resisting the parts that reduced women to ornaments or caricatures. She gravitated toward tragic heroines, women whose beauty concealed sorrow, whose strength was born from loss. These roles mirrored something in herself, though whether she recognized it or merely instinctively gravitated toward it remains uncertain. And always, behind her choices, the shadow of Stiller lingered. He had once demanded control over her every gesture, but now she shaped herself. His absence gave her freedom, yet his influence could not be erased. When he died in 1928, she remained silent, offering no public mourning. Yet those who knew her sensed the depth of her grief, held close, as always, within. The city outside her window still hummed each night, but within her rooms the silence deepened. John Gilbert drifted away, Stiller was gone, and though her fame rose ever higher, her solitude grew with it. Perhaps she understood already what others would only later realize, that to maintain the mystery, she must also embrace the solitude it demanded. The applause in theaters thundered, yet in the quiet spaces of her life, the only sound was the echo of footsteps receding, one by one, until she was alone again. The echo of footsteps that once filled her private world soon gave way to the endless clicking of camera shutters, a rhythm that would follow her every movement in Hollywood. Here the studios did not rest. From sunrise to sunset, men with cameras and lights chased shadows and faces, building illusions that would be sold across the globe. Garbo, still learning the weight of her new existence, stood within this storm like a figure from another land, her silence at odds with the chatter around her. Los Angeles was unlike any place she had ever known. The sun pressed down upon the earth with an intensity that seemed almost unnatural to one raised under northern skies. Oranges ripened in groves on the city's edges, filling the air with a sweet fragrance that mingled with the harsh scent of gasoline from automobiles rushing through the expanding streets. Palm trees lined boulevards, their fronds rattling in the wind, casting long shadows at dusk. To Greta, the brightness was both dazzling and alien, too harsh for her spirit that had been shaped in winters of gray. The studios themselves were like cities within the city, vast compounds with painted backdrops, cavernous sound stages, and costumed extras waiting in crowds for their moment before the lens. Garbo walked among them quietly, her tall figure noticed by all. Assistants whispered of her beauty, though it was not the soft beauty of American starlets, but something sharper, almost sculpted. She did not chatter with the crews nor laugh with the other actors. She saved her presence for the camera, and in this restraint lay her power. On set, she learned to move slowly with deliberation. Silent films required more than words could convey. They demanded that eyes, hands, and posture speak entire volumes. Directors soon discovered that she could hold a scene with stillness alone, her gaze suggesting inner lives audiences could only guess at. Where others exaggerated gestures, Garbo pared them away, leaving only essence. This restraint, born of her own natural shyness, became her signature. Her breakthrough performances secured her place among MGM's prized stars, yet off-screen she remained a puzzle. Invitations to parties were politely declined. Reporters who sought her thoughts found themselves facing only silence or a few careful words in broken English. She walked the studio lots with her head slightly lowered, avoiding the gaze of strangers. To many she seemed cold, but to those who looked more closely, there was something almost fragile in her distance, as though she were shielding herself from a world too eager to consume her. The clash between her inward nature and Hollywood's demands soon became a quiet battle. Studio executives valued stars who charmed the press, who appeared at premieres, who laughed and mingled in the bright salons of Los Angeles society. Garbo resisted all of it. She refused interviews. She avoided photographers. She insisted on privacy. At first, the studio feared this would harm her career, but to their surprise, the opposite occurred. The more she withheld, the more the public hungered for her. Silence became her most potent publicity. The absence of her words invited speculation, and speculation grew into fascination. Still, behind the shimmering posters and the gossip columns, her life was filled with isolation. She missed her mother, her sister, her brother. Letters from Sweden arrived, carrying news of lives that continued without her. She sent money home, a gesture of love and duty, but she rarely wrote in detail about her own life. How could she explain this strange world to those who had never seen it? How could she describe the endless lights, the heavy makeup, the way strangers measured her value in dollars and ticket sales? There were evenings when she walked alone through Los Angeles streets, the air still warm after sunset, the scent of flowers heavy in the gardens. Yet even then, she was not free. Strangers recognized her, followed her with curious eyes. She longed for anonymity, for the freedom to move unseen, but fame had already wrapped itself around her like a net. In response, she retreated further, building walls of silence, choosing solitude over exposure. Her performances deepened during this time. Films like A Woman of Affairs and The Divine Woman revealed the unique way she could embody sorrow and longing. Her characters seemed to echo her own private struggles, women caught between love and duty, between freedom and constraint. Audiences saw tragedy in her eyes, and they believed it was real. Perhaps it was. Perhaps the line between her roles and her life was thinner than anyone realized. Meanwhile, Hollywood changed around her. The industry grew, the studios expanded, the demand for stars intensified. Scandals erupted, fortunes rose and fell, yet through it all, Garbo maintained her distance. She avoided entanglements that might tarnish her image, though whispers of romance continued to follow her. John Gilbert's presence in her life remained strong for a time, their bond visible to anyone who looked. Yet, as always, her need for freedom warred with her desire for closeness. She loved, yet she retreated. She drew near, then turned away. This rhythm of approach and withdrawal would define her relationships for years to come. It was in these early Hollywood years that Garbo began to cultivate the aura that would define her for the rest of her life. She was not like other stars. She did not belong fully to the glittering world around her. She was foreign, distant, mysterious, a figure half in shadow. She seemed always to carry with her the gray skies of Sweden, even beneath California's sun. And audiences, far from being repelled, were drawn to her all the more. But fame, once it wraps itself around a person, does not easily loosen its hold. Each new film brought her greater recognition. Each new photograph spread her face further across the globe. And with each passing day, her solitude deepened. Her retreat became more necessary. In this paradox lay her destiny, to be most desired when she was most absent, to be most visible when she most longed to be unseen. The clicking of camera shutters followed her everywhere, filling the silence of her days, a sound that grew as constant as breath. And yet, within the noise, she remained still, holding her secrets close, speaking little, offering only what she chose. The clicking of camera shutters did not fade when the films began to roll. Instead, it merged with the whirring of projectors and the silent flicker of images upon the screen. In this world without spoken words, Garbo found her truest voice. Her stillness, which in ordinary life had seemed like shyness or even coldness, became a luminous language under the light of the camera. The screen enlarged her presence, her eyes filling the darkness of the theater, speaking to audiences more clearly than any line of dialogue could have done. Silent cinema demanded exaggeration from most of its actors, broad gestures, emphatic expressions, movements almost theatrical in their sweep. But Garbo approached it differently. She seemed to strip away the unnecessary, letting silence breathe, letting space itself become part of her performance. She moved slowly, deliberately, and her face carried subtleties that astonished directors. A tilt of her head, the faintest curve of her lips, the narrowing of her eyes, these became the dramatic gestures by which she held entire audiences captive. While others acted, she seemed to simply exist, and that existence was enough. It was her eyes above all that mesmerized. Large, liquid, luminous, even in black and white, they contained multitudes. When she gazed into the distance, she seemed to be seeing something others could not. When she looked at another actor, the intensity of her focus created an intimacy that filled the screen. Audiences felt that she was speaking directly to them, though not a sound was uttered. In that silence, the imagination of viewers was set free, filling the space with whatever longing or sorrow they carried within themselves. Garbo became a mirror in which others saw their own hidden emotions reflected. The film Flesh and the Devil made this undeniable. In scenes with John Gilbert, the chemistry between them was not conveyed by grand declarations or frantic movements, but by pauses, by lingering glances, by the quiet magnetism of two bodies leaning toward one another. When their lips met on screen, audiences gasped, for it felt less like a staged kiss and more like a revelation of something forbidden. It was in silence that Garbo made desire visible, and in silence that she suggested tragedy was always near. Her reputation grew quickly. She was no longer simply a star imported from Sweden at the insistence of a demanding director. She was now recognized as a phenomenon. Critics struggled to describe her, using words like mystical, enigmatic, haunting. Yet no description ever seemed sufficient, for what she conveyed was beyond language. She was a presence, not easily captured by phrases. And perhaps this elusiveness was part of her appeal. The public longed to know who she truly was, but the very act of longing kept the fascination alive. Still, as her fame soared, Garbo's solitude deepened. The very qualities that made her remarkable on screen set her apart in life. She was not inclined toward chatter or charm. She did not seek the company of fellow actors when the cameras were off. Instead, she withdrew, retreating to her rooms, walking alone, seeking quiet. To some, this seemed arrogance, but to those who knew her, it was simply the way she was made. Silence was her refuge, as it was her art. In those days, as Hollywood glittered with parties and social gatherings, Garbo was rarely seen among the throngs. She declined invitations, preferring the company of a few trusted friends or the solitude of her own thoughts. When the press pressed for interviews, she demurred. When asked to smile for photographers, she often turned her face aside. To an industry that thrived on publicity, this was unusual, even reckless. Yet the mystery it created proved more powerful than any orchestrated campaign. She became the star who said nothing, and in that nothing, she said more than all the others. The world leaned closer to her image. Men and women alike were drawn to her, though few could claim to know her truly. She seemed both vulnerable and untouchable, near and impossibly distant. And as she continued to embody heroines on screen, women torn by love, by sacrifice, by destiny, audiences believed they were glimpsing something of her own soul. They saw in her performances the echo of her private sadness, though she never confirmed or denied it. Yet what did it cost her to carry such a burden of projection? Alone in her apartment, the sound of applause did not reach her. Letters from family arrived, reminding her of the life she had left behind in Sweden, a life of narrow streets and laundry steam, a life simpler and more comprehensible than the one she now lived. She answered rarely, keeping her emotions guarded even from those who loved her most. Fame had brought her power, but it had also built walls around her, walls that grew taller with each new success. Still, in those early silent films, she seemed to find something close to harmony. The medium suited her perfectly. It allowed her to express without speaking, to remain silent even while being seen by millions. She could give herself to the audience without surrendering her voice, without breaking the protective veil of her reticence. For a time, perhaps, she felt she had discovered the rare balance between exposure and concealment. But cinema was changing. The whisper of new technology spread across Hollywood, the promise of sound, the talkies that would soon transform everything. For Garbo, whose art was silence itself, the thought of speaking on screen carried both danger and possibility. Would her voice betray the mystery her eyes had built? Would the magic dissolve when the audience heard her accent, her careful English, her quiet tones? These questions lingered, unspoken, in the air of every studio meeting, every conversation among producers and critics. In the meantime, she continued to perfect the art of silence. With each new role, she refined her presence, shedding more of the unnecessary, distilling her performance to its essence. She became not just a star, but an icon of an entire era of cinema, the golden age of silent film. Audiences flocked to see her, not for what she did, but for what she was, the embodiment of mystery itself. And yet, even as her stillness spoke volumes, she must have felt the shadow of change creeping closer. The sound of shutters clicking would soon be joined by another sound, the fragile, intimate resonance of her own voice. The fragile, intimate resonance of her own voice, still unheard by the public, haunted her long before it was ever captured by a microphone. For Garbo, silence had been a shelter, a veil that protected her from exposure, and the thought of speaking, truly speaking, with words understood and judged, was a prospect filled with unease. She knew her English was halting, her accent thick, her phrasing careful to the point of hesitation. Each word felt like a risk. Each sentence seemed to reveal more of her inner life than she wished the world to see. In her daily life, this difficulty with language pressed heavily upon her. On the studio lots, among directors, producers, and fellow actors, she often listened rather than spoke. She caught fragments of conversations but missed their full rhythm, and so she withdrew, nodding quietly, offering only brief replies. At social gatherings where laughter and chatter flowed as easily as wine, she felt herself a stranger. To sit silently in a room filled with voices was, for her, more natural than to join in. Yet her silence, misread by those around her, soon became a subject of gossip. They said she was proud, aloof, even disdainful. Few considered that silence might be the language she had chosen for survival. Loneliness deepened. Letters from Sweden carried familiar words, comforting in their rhythm, but they also reminded her of the distance she had placed between herself and her family. She read of her mother's days, of her siblings' lives, of the slow turning of seasons in her homeland. She longed for the sound of Swedish spoken casually in streets and shops, a sound that was effortless rather than strained. In Hollywood, every word she spoke required effort. Every phrase seemed to highlight her separateness. Her isolation was not only linguistic, but also cultural. Hollywood was built on spectacle, on parties glittering with champagne and lights, on a relentless exchange of favors and appearances. Stars were expected to be visible, to cultivate their fame with smiles and anecdotes. Garbo recoiled from such demands. She preferred the quiet of her apartment, the solitude of walks where she could pass unnoticed. Yet even there she was rarely free. Photographers followed her, hungry for glimpses of the star who so rarely revealed herself. When caught, she turned her face away, hiding beneath hats, her silence now matched by invisibility. But the world did not let her go. Each new film brought more attention, and her performances continued to deepen the fascination. She seemed to embody loneliness itself, her heroines often trapped between longing and loss, their silence echoing her own. Audiences saw their private sorrows reflected in her, and they mistook this for knowledge of her inner life. They believed they understood her, though in truth she revealed only fragments, carefully chosen and wrapped in mystery. Her directors, too, felt the tension between her silence and their expectations. Some grew frustrated with her reticence, mistaking it for indifference. Others recognized its power, realizing that she needed little instruction, for her instincts carried her performances further than technical direction ever could. On set, she was precise, obedient to the rhythm of the camera, yet she also held herself apart, never mingling fully with cast or crew once the day's work was finished. This distance created its own mythology. Journalists began to describe her as a woman of mystery, a star who refused to play the Hollywood game. She was not seen at parties. She gave no long interviews. She did not smile for the sake of promotion. Instead, she seemed to retreat further into herself, offering the public only her screen presence. And in this withholding, she grew more powerful than any who courted publicity. Still, solitude carries its own cost. There were mornings when she did not rise from bed, curtains drawn against the brilliant California sun. Depression lingered at the edges of her life, a shadow that followed her even in moments of triumph. She felt the weight of expectation, the hunger of the world for more of her mystery, and yet she knew she could never satisfy it fully. To give herself would be to lose herself, and so she clung to silence, even as it threatened to consume her. In these moments, her friends saw another side of her, one less polished, less guarded. With those she trusted, she could laugh, even play, her humor dry and unexpected. She enjoyed long walks, the simplicity of shared meals, the comfort of companionship that did not demand too much. But such moments were rare, reserved for a few. To the rest of the world, she remained Garbo, the woman who withdrew, who spoke little, who seemed carved from marble, yet filled with shadows. As the talkies loomed closer, her anxieties grew. The studio prepared carefully, knowing that the transition from silent to sound would make or break many careers. Voices would be revealed, accents exposed, and the illusion of universality that silent film provided would be shattered. Garbo's silence, which had been her greatest strength, now threatened to become her greatest vulnerability. She wondered, in private, if her career would end before it had truly begun. And yet, in that uncertainty, there was also a strange sense of inevitability. She had never chosen this life fully. It had been chosen for her by circumstance, by Stiller's vision, by Hollywood's hunger. Perhaps, she thought, if it ended, she would be free to return to something simpler, something closer to the life she had left behind. But fate, as always, had other designs. For now, the city outside continued to hum, its voices rising and falling in a language she did not fully share. Inside, she sat in stillness, her thoughts circling, her silence deepening, her presence waiting to be transformed once again. The ink of an unfinished letter dried quietly on her desk. Words stopped in mid-sentence, as if she could not bring herself to say what was truly within her heart. The ink of the unfinished letter lay still upon her desk, its last word trailing off into silence, as though even the page could not contain what she might have confessed. It was in such silences that the world began to imagine the contours of her private life, filling the void with whispers of romance, longing, and secrets never spoken aloud. Greta Garbo, the woman who shared so little of herself, became the canvas for endless speculation. And though she never confirmed nor denied, the mystery itself grew more powerful than any truth could have been. The first and most enduring of these whispers clung to John Gilbert. Their on-screen passion in Flesh and the Devil had been so potent that audiences believed it must have been real. Off-screen, their closeness was undeniable. Gilbert was expressive, impulsive, a man of bold gestures and declarations. Garbo, by contrast, was hesitant, wary, a creature of retreat. Yet for a time, the two moved together in a rhythm that seemed to defy their differences. He pursued her with intensity. She allowed herself to be drawn near, and for a brief season, it appeared that Hollywood had found in them its golden pair. Yet Garbo's fear of entanglement surfaced again and again. Gilbert wished for permanence, for marriage, for the anchoring of their bond in ceremony. Garbo hesitated. The very idea of belonging to another, even one she cherished, seemed to threaten her fragile independence. Some stories claim she left him waiting at the altar, though others insist the tale is more myth than fact. What is certain is that their love, once aflame, cooled into distance. Gilbert's heart, already fragile, bore the wound deeply. To the public, it was a story of betrayal. To Garbo, perhaps, it was survival, the choice to preserve herself rather than surrender to a closeness she could not endure. From this moment onward, rumors multiplied. Garbo's beauty and presence drew many toward her, yet her secrecy made it impossible to know whom she truly loved. Some believed she held other men close. Others whispered of women whose companionship touched her more deeply. The truth was blurred, half hidden in fragments of letters, in fleeting photographs, in stories passed between friends. Mercedes de Acosta, the Spanish-American writer and socialite, was often named in these tales. Their friendship was intense, filled with letters and shared confidences, yet its nature remained cloaked in ambiguity. Some of Mercedes' letters suggest passion, longing, devotion, while Garbo's responses were more restrained, cautious, and at times evasive. Was theirs a romance, or was it a friendship made luminous by secrecy? The world could not decide, and Garbo, as always, gave no answer. Others claimed she shared a bond with Marlene Dietrich, though the details are tangled in rumor, speculation, and the blurred memories of those who lived near the glittering edges of Hollywood society. Some insisted they were rivals. Others whispered they were lovers. The truth remains hidden in the silence Garbo carried, for she never spoke directly of such matters, and perhaps never wished to. What is striking is not the certainty of these relationships, but the uncertainty itself. Garbo seemed to cultivate, intentionally or not, an atmosphere in which doubt and rumor thrived. Her refusal to confirm or deny gave her power. By withholding, she allowed others to imagine, and in imagination she became larger than life. For every name spoken in connection to her, there were dozens of stories, each adding to the myth. Yet one must ask, what did it mean for her, this endless speculation? Did she find comfort in the distance it created, or was she wounded by the intrusion into her private life? She desired solitude, yet her very silence drew the world closer, pressing against the walls she built around herself. The more she concealed, the more others sought to uncover, and so the cycle of secrecy and rumor deepened. There is something profoundly human in this paradox. Garbo's silence was both a refuge and a trap. It protected her from exposure, but it also made her unknowable, even to those who longed to love her. Relationships, whether with men or women, seemed to stumble upon the same stone. Her unwillingness to surrender her independence, her inability to live fully within the grasp of another's embrace. She desired closeness, yet fled from it. She sought intimacy, yet feared its cost. And so her loves, like her unfinished letters, remained incomplete, ending abruptly in silence. On screen, however, this very tension became her art. Her heroines embodied the struggle between passion and restraint, between desire and renunciation. When she looked at a lover in a film, audiences saw the real uncertainty of her own heart. When she turned away, they felt the authenticity of her withdrawal. It was as though her performances were confessions she could never speak aloud, truths revealed only in the shadows of projected light. As the rumors swirled, Garbo seemed almost indifferent, or at least resigned. She allowed others to talk while she remained silent. She walked the streets alone. She refused the parties where gossip thrived. She lived in apartments where curtains were often drawn. Her solitude was her shield, her silence her answer. In the end, perhaps it mattered little whether the whispers were true or false, for the mystery itself became the essence of her legend. And yet, one cannot help but wonder, when she sat in her room at night with only the hum of the city for company, did she think of the loves she had let slip away? Did she regret the unfinished letters, the unspoken words, the doors closed before they could be opened? Or did she find in her solitude the peace she could never achieve in the arms of another? The door half closed, the sound of footsteps lingering just beyond became the image of her life, a presence that invited approach but never fully welcomed it. And in that hesitation, she remained forever apart, forever untouchable, forever Garbo. The door half closed, the sound of footsteps lingering beyond it, became not only the pattern of her relationships, but the pattern of her entire existence. In Hollywood, where every other door swung wide to the public, Garbo's remained half shut, leaving the world to peer through a narrow opening, never sure what lay beyond. It was here, in the tension between presence and absence, that her myth took its deepest root. Fame in the 20s and 30s was a force that demanded submission. Studios orchestrated every detail of their stars' lives, from the clothes they wore in public to the words they offered to magazines. Reporters were fed stories, photographs were staged, scandals were smoothed or fabricated as needed. A star was expected to live not as themselves, but as an ever-glittering symbol, visible at all hours. Garbo refused. She declined interviews. She dismissed staged photographs. She rejected invitations to premieres of her own films. When asked for witty remarks or personal anecdotes, she offered silence, or at most, a single, guarded sentence. At first, the studios bristled. Executives feared she would damage her appeal, that her absence from public life would leave audiences cold. Yet something entirely different occurred. Her refusal became her allure. The less she offered, the more she was desired. Audiences filled the void with their own imaginings. Who was this woman who denied them access, who seemed to exist only on screen and nowhere else? They longed to know, and in that longing her fame grew greater than that of those who gave themselves away too easily. She seemed to understand this instinctively. Absence became her art as much as performance. By withholding herself, she created a hunger that no amount of exposure could satisfy. When her films opened, lines curled around blocks, not because she had charmed reporters, but because she had withheld her charm entirely. She was the woman glimpsed but never grasped, the figure who stepped into the light only in shadows of projected reels. Still, her resistance was not strategy alone. It was her nature. Garbo recoiled from the glare of publicity, not to build a myth, but because she could not endure the intrusion. She longed for solitude, for the quiet that allowed her to breathe, to think, to remain herself. The parties of Hollywood, filled with laughter and clinking glasses, drained her spirit. The endless chatter of journalists seeking quotes made her retreat. She found no nourishment in the applause of crowds. Instead, she sought silence, a few trusted companions, long walks under trees, the comfort of spaces where she could vanish into anonymity. The paradox was inescapable. The very world that adored her was the one from which she fled. The more she resisted, the louder the world clamored. The less she spoke, the more they listened. Silence, once a burden, now became her power. There are stories of reporters waiting for hours outside her apartment, only to glimpse her for a moment as she stepped into the street. They chased her car, hoping for a photograph, but she turned her face away, leaving them with little more than a blurred outline. Neighbors whispered of her reclusiveness, of curtains drawn even in daylight. Those who were granted entry into her circle spoke cautiously, as if describing someone both present and absent, open and closed. She was never one to confess, never one to explain. And yet, despite her withdrawal, her performances glowed with intimacy. On screen, she revealed emotions that felt unbearably real, so much so that audiences believed they knew her better than any of the talkative stars who lived their lives in magazines. They felt the tremor of her sorrow, the depth of her longing, the quiet fire of her passion. They carried her image in their hearts, convinced that the woman they saw on screen was the woman who lived beyond it. Perhaps that belief was not entirely false. Her art was not a mask, but a distillation, a revelation only she could give in the safety of performance. Still, the question remains, did her retreat into silence bring her peace, or did it deepen her loneliness? Some said she was happiest in solitude, that she needed it as much as air. Others believed it was a shield, a wall she built out of fear, even as she longed for the closeness it denied her. The truth, as always with Garbo, lived somewhere in the shadows between. Her refusal of publicity became legendary. Once, when asked by a persistent reporter why she shunned the limelight, she replied only, "I want to be alone." The words, repeated endlessly, became her most famous phrase, though she later insisted she had been misunderstood. She did not mean loneliness. She meant privacy. Yet the world, hungry for symbols, turned her words into a mantra of mystery, repeating them as if they revealed her soul. In time, the studio executives stopped resisting her withdrawal and began to market it instead. They leaned into her aura of secrecy, presenting her as the sphinx of the screen, the woman beyond reach. Posters and advertisements played upon her enigma, turning her silence into spectacle. What had once been her rebellion became part of her image, and though it gave her power, it also locked her into the role of the eternal mystery. Her life in Hollywood grew ever more divided. On set, under the lights, she was luminous, her eyes and gestures holding entire theaters spellbound. Off-set, she was a shadow, vanishing into rooms with drawn curtains, refusing the gaze of the world. The city outside bustled with chatter and celebration, but within her walls, silence reigned. And so the myth of Garbo was built not upon what she gave, but upon what she withheld. She was the star who refused to shine on command, the woman who kept her door half closed, the presence that grew all the more powerful through absence. The sound of shutters closing in empty rooms echoed through her days, the silence deepening as the world leaned ever closer, yearning for what she would not give. The sound of shutters closing lingered in empty rooms, but beyond those rooms another sound was rising, faint at first and then unstoppable. The arrival of voices in cinema, the dawn of the talkies. For years, Garbo had built her legend upon silence, her eyes and gestures carrying weight enough to enthrall the world. Yet silence itself was no longer sufficient. Technology was advancing, audiences were curious, and studios trembled at the thought that their most luminous stars might be extinguished by the simple demand to speak. For Garbo, the prospect of sound was not merely technical, but deeply personal. She had lived within silence, relied upon it as her sanctuary, and now it threatened to be stripped away. Her English, careful and slow, carried the heavy accent of her homeland. She feared ridicule, feared that the mystery she had built would collapse the moment her voice filled the air. Alone at night, she may have wondered if this was the end of her brief and dazzling ascent. Would the voice betray the woman the world had imagined her to be? The studio, cautious yet desperate, prepared her debut in sound with care. They knew that if she failed, it could cost them their most valuable star. If she succeeded, it would mark a new era. The chosen film was Anna Christie in 1930, a story steeped in shadows, longing, and the kind of tragedy that suited her aura. Garbo herself, wary of exposure, approached it with a seriousness that bordered on dread. She rehearsed, she practiced, she guarded each word. The set was hushed, as though everyone present understood that history was about to shift. When at last her voice was heard, it carried not the fragility she had feared, but a low, measured tone, almost husky, resonant with distance. "Give me a whiskey, ginger ale on the side, and don't be stingy, baby," were the first words audiences heard, and with them a legend was reborn. The irony was cruel and perfect. The woman who wished most for silence entered the era of sound by commanding drink in a smoky bar. The phrase Garbo Talks became both a slogan and a cultural event. The mystery was not diminished, it was deepened. Her voice, far from ruining her image, seemed to complete it, adding another layer of strangeness and allure. Audiences leaned forward as they had with her eyes in the silent years, now caught by the cadence of her speech. The accent that had once made her hesitant in public became, on screen, a mark of difference, of exoticism, of something set apart from ordinary life. Her voice did not belong to Hollywood's chatter. It belonged to another world, darker, heavier, filled with sorrow. The risk had transformed into triumph. She was not only preserved in this new age of sound, she was elevated. Yet for Garbo herself, the triumph was bittersweet. She had survived the transition, but it came at a cost. Her silence could no longer be her shield. Now she was asked to speak, to let her voice carry the emotions once contained in her gaze. Though she did so with mastery, one suspects it strained her, for her true nature was always inclined toward withholding rather than revealing. Each role required her to surrender a little more of herself, and the weight of that surrender pressed upon her spirit. In Mata Hari Grand Hotel and later Queen Christina, she wielded both her voice and her presence with astonishing command. She could shift from coldness to tenderness within a breath, from passion to resignation with the faintest turn of her head. Her voice was low, deliberate, heavy with meanings not fully spoken, and it matched her silence perfectly. It was not chatter. It was a continuation of the stillness she had always carried, now clothed in sound. The press, of course, swarmed to her transformation. They quoted her lines. They marveled at her endurance. They declared her mystery unbroken. But Garbo herself withdrew further. Fame, magnified now by sound, weighed heavier than ever. She declined interviews, shunned parties, and built walls higher around her private life. If silence had once been enough to shield her, now she needed absence as well. She vanished between films, retreating to solitude, letting only her screen roles speak for her. This vanishing act, paradoxical and deliberate, only inflamed the fascination. She was the star who disappeared between appearances, the voice that spoke only on film, the woman glimpsed but never grasped. Absence became her greatest presence, and silence, even now broken by words, remained her most enduring language. Yet, what must it have been like, in the quiet of her rooms, after the applause had faded, after her voice had echoed across theaters filled with strangers? Did she sit in the stillness, relieved to be mute again, or did she feel the loneliness sharpen because her most private fear had been conquered only for the sake of the world? These are questions no biography can fully answer, for Garbo herself left them unanswered. What is certain is that her transformation into the era of sound did not diminish her, as many had feared, but rather sealed her place as something unique in cinema. Where others stumbled and fell, she walked steadily. Her silence turned into sound without losing its weight, and the audience, once again, leaned closer, drawn not by her accessibility but by the distance she continued to preserve. Her voice lingered in theaters, even after the reels stopped spinning, but in her private spaces, it faded once more into silence. The world outside clamored for more, while inside her own walls, only the quiet breathing of solitude remained. And as her voice dissolved back into that silence, the faint outline of another shadow approached, the melancholy that grew as surely as her fame. Her voice dissolved back into silence, and within that silence she often remained for days at a time. Behind the drawn curtains of her apartment, where the bright California sun could not intrude, she retreated into a solitude so deep that friends and colleagues whispered of her melancholy. Fame had carried her into the gaze of millions, yet in her private hours she seemed to resist even the gaze of light itself. The windows stayed shuttered, the rooms dim, as though she sought not only escape from the world, but escape from herself. Depression was a word rarely spoken openly in those years, yet its shadow lingered heavily in her life. There were mornings when she did not rise from bed, when the weight of existence pressed her down with invisible hands. The studio might call, assistants might knock, but she remained hidden beneath blankets, her thoughts circling in silence. Work could rouse her, for she was disciplined and professional when the cameras demanded her presence. But when the lights went dark, the shadow returned. Those who knew her described these spells as periods of withdrawal rather than collapse. She would vanish from the company of others, decline all invitations, and allow no one near. Days slipped into weeks, her presence noted only by the rare sight of her walking alone, hat pulled low, eyes fixed upon the ground. The city outside thrummed with life, but she carried within her a winter that seemed unending. Why did she retreat so deeply? Was it the exhaustion of fame, the endless hunger of strangers who sought to consume her image? Was it the loneliness of exile, a woman far from the language and soil that had shaped her? Or was it something more inward still, a sorrow that no success could soothe. These questions remain unanswered, yet the heaviness of her solitude cannot be denied. On set, she could transform this weight into art. Her heroines, often tragic, carried the same shadows she bore in private. When she played women consumed by love, by loss, by fate, she was not merely acting. She was revealing, through performance, the depths she otherwise concealed. Audiences felt the truth of her sorrow, though they mistook it for the sorrow of her characters. Perhaps that was her salvation, that she could empty her private grief into her roles, releasing it safely under the guise of fiction. But once the reel stopped, once the costumes were returned and the sets dismantled, she faced herself again in silence. Letters to friends and confidants sometimes carried a weariness, a longing for escape. To one, she wrote of her desire simply to be left alone, to live quietly, free from the demands of a world that never ceased watching. She dreamed of travel, of retreat, of slipping away into anonymity. And though she achieved some of this in later years, at the height of her fame, she was bound to the machinery of Hollywood, unable to disappear fully no matter how deeply she drew her curtains. It was not that she lacked companionship. There were those who cared for her, who tried to draw her from her solitude. Friends, lovers, colleagues reached toward her, yet she met them always with a measure of distance. She feared closeness, feared the loss of independence, feared perhaps the exposure of the vulnerability she so carefully guarded. Intimacy, when it arrived, seemed to bring her as much sorrow as comfort. And so, time and again, she withdrew. Even in her solitude, she was never free from rumor. The press, shut out from her private life, invented stories to fill the void. They speculated about her sadness, her romances, her reclusion. Some spoke of arrogance, others of fragility. The truth remained hidden, known only to her and perhaps not even fully to herself. What is striking is how the very things that tormented her in private, her melancholy, her retreat, her silence, became, on screen, her greatest strengths. The sorrow in her eyes, the weight in her voice, the restraint in her gestures, all bore the stamp of authenticity. She did not need to feign tragedy, for she carried its shadow within her, and in this way her art and her life were bound, inseparable, each feeding the other in an endless cycle. There were brief moments of light. At times she would emerge from her solitude to share a walk, a dinner, a laugh with those few she trusted. Her humor, dry and unexpected, would surface, surprising those who knew only the image of the solemn star. She could be playful, irreverent, even childlike in her delight when freed from the burden of performance. But these glimpses were fleeting, soon swallowed again by the silence that defined her. And so her life in these years oscillated between two poles: the blazing light of the screen, where she revealed sorrow to the world, and the heavy darkness of her rooms, where she hid from it. Perhaps she found a strange balance in this rhythm, a way to survive the contradictions of fame and solitude. Yet one cannot help but imagine her, sitting alone, curtains drawn, wondering if the applause she earned was worth the silence that followed. The faint light of morning often pressed against those curtains, unable to pierce them fully. Outside, the world continued, cars passing, neighbors speaking, children playing, but within, only shadow remained. And from that shadow, another chapter of her life emerged, the quiet, uncertain affections she shared with women whose presence stirred her heart in ways the world would never fully know. The faint light of morning pressed against the heavy curtains, but within those dim rooms, another kind of intimacy unfolded, quiet, ambiguous, never fully revealed. Greta Garbo, who withdrew so fiercely from the demands of the world, allowed only a few companions into her circle. Among them were women whose presence seemed to stir her in ways different from fleeting studio romances or the loud declarations of men. Here, In these secret bonds, the lines between friendship and passion blurred, creating spaces both tender and uncertain. Mercedes de Acosta was perhaps the most enduring of these companions. A writer, a woman of sharp wit and restless energy, Mercedes entered Garbo's life with a force that left marks upon both. Their correspondence survives in fragments, enough to suggest a bond deeper than ordinary friendship. Mercedes wrote to her with longing, with devotion, with words that carried the weight of desire. Garbo's replies were less revealing, cautious, careful, often brief. Yet even in her restraint, one senses the intimacy between them, a closeness she rarely permitted. Letters are strange mirrors. They reveal as much in what is unsaid as in what is confessed. Mercedes wrote of her love, of her yearning to see Garbo, of the pain of separation. Garbo's replies, though restrained, did not sever the bond. She kept the connection alive, neither denying nor fully returning the passion. Was this reluctance fear of exposure, a resistance to surrender, or was it simply her nature, to hold even love at arm's length? The truth remains folded in silence, like the letters themselves, some hidden, some destroyed, some surviving as whispers of what passed between them. Other names drift through the fog of rumor. Marlene Dietrich, with whom she may have shared a fleeting intimacy. Actresses and artists whose paths crossed hers in the hidden salons of Hollywood and Europe. The truth of these encounters is lost, obscured by time, by secrecy, by the deliberate concealment of lives lived in shadows. In an era when such bonds could not be spoken of openly, silence was both protection and prison. Yet one cannot overlook the tenderness that flowed through these relationships. With women, Garbo seemed to find a kind of companionship that did not threaten her independence as much as the demands of men often did. She could laugh, share confidences, walk without fear of being consumed. There was an ease in such company, though even then she kept her deepest self hidden. For Garbo was never one to confess fully, even to those she cherished. She was, perhaps, afraid of being known completely. What is striking is how these secret bonds shaped her presence on screen. Her heroines often carried an air of forbidden passion, of longing that could not be openly declared. When she looked at another character with intensity, audiences felt the weight of desire restrained, as though something unspoken pressed beneath the surface. Whether intentional or instinctive, her performances seemed to reflect the ambiguity of her private affections, the desire for closeness entwined with the fear of exposure. The world outside, of course, whispered endlessly. Rumors swirled in studio corridors, in columns written with veiled language, in salons where gossip thrived. But Garbo herself remained silent, neither confirming nor denying. In this, she retained her power. For what is more alluring than a secret half glimpsed? The very absence of clarity made her legend stronger. She became not only a star, but an enigma of desire itself, a figure who embodied both passion and distance, intimacy and withdrawal. Did she love deeply? Almost certainly. Did she surrender fully? Almost never. Her heart, though stirred, seemed always to retreat behind walls of silence. Perhaps she feared that to belong to another was to lose herself, that intimacy carried within it the seed of entrapment. And so she loved, but incompletely. She gave, but always withheld. Her companions felt the warmth of her presence, yet also the chill of her distance. This paradox, painful for those who drew close to her, was also the essence of her mystery. It was what made her simultaneously irresistible and unreachable. It was what made her art so powerful, for on screen she embodied the eternal struggle between desire and restraint, between longing and solitude. And yet one imagines her at night, the curtain still drawn, sitting with an unfinished letter on her desk, a letter she could not bring herself to send. Did she wonder what life might have been if she had surrendered more fully, if she had allowed herself to be held without fear? Or did she believe quietly that her solitude was the only truth she could ever trust? A folded letter, hidden in a drawer, carries within it the weight of love restrained, of passion unspoken, of intimacy deferred. And from that folded letter, the story of her journeys across Europe begins to unfold, each new city another attempt at escape, another shadowed chapter in the long silence she carried. The folded letter lay hidden in a drawer, its ink sealed away from the eyes for which it had been intended. Perhaps it traveled with her in thought when she crossed the ocean once more, seeking refuge not in Hollywood's relentless brightness, but in the softer shadows of Europe. For Garbo, travel was not merely movement across maps, but a search for spaces where she might escape the weight of her name, where she might wander among strangers as though she were no one at all. Paris became one such refuge. The city, with its rain-soaked boulevards and narrow cobbled lanes, offered anonymity in its endless crowds. She walked beneath the dripping trees of the Tuileries, the scent of wet earth and chestnuts rising in the air, her steps unhurried, her hat pulled low. Passers-by glanced without recognition, or if they did recognize, they whispered quietly, rather than intruding. Here, among the muted sounds of footsteps and rain, she found a kind of freedom impossible in Los Angeles. The city's melancholy matched her own, its gray skies reflecting the shadow she carried within. She stayed in apartments that overlooked quiet courtyards, where the sound of bells from distant churches mingled with the calls of vendors in the streets below. In such places she could vanish into ordinariness, living without the constant hum of publicity. She frequented cafes, choosing tables in corners, watching smoke curl upward from cigarettes, listening without the need to join in. The French language, though not her own, wrapped around her like a veil, softening the sharp edges of English that had so often exposed her. And yet, even in these moments of freedom, she was never entirely unknown. Word would spread of her presence, and admirers would search for glimpses. But Paris, unlike Hollywood, seemed to respect her silence. The city, long accustomed to poets and exiles, allowed her solitude, recognizing in her reserve a kind of kinship with its own soul. Beyond Paris, she traveled through Europe, returning at times to Sweden, where the cold air of her childhood still clung to the narrow streets. She walked again in Södermalm, where laundry once steamed and her mother had labored, but now she returned as one transformed, a figure both of home and of elsewhere. The familiarity comforted her, yet it also deepened her sense of distance. She no longer belonged fully to the place of her birth, nor did she belong to Hollywood. She drifted between worlds, always a visitor, never entirely at home. In these travels, she carried her solitude like luggage. Companions sometimes joined her, friends, lovers, confidants, but even in company she remained apart, her inner life folded and hidden like the letters she never sent. Those who walked beside her often spoke of her silences, how she could wander for hours without words, content to let the world pass around her while she remained still within. Europe in the 1930s was itself a place of shadows, the weight of history pressing down, the signs of conflict already stirring beneath the surface. Garbo, sensitive to the moods of places, seemed to mirror this unease. Her roles in these years reflected a world tilting toward tragedy. Anna Karenina, Camille, her performances carrying the same weight as the streets she walked abroad. She became the embodiment of endings, of sorrow born with grace, of beauty that could not protect against loss. In Paris, she was sometimes seen at gatherings of artists and writers, yet always she kept herself to the edges. She observed, listened, absorbed, but rarely revealed. Those who met her spoke of her presence as unforgettable, yet also as elusive. She could sit in a room for hours, saying little, and still be the center of attention, not because she sought it, but because silence itself radiated from her like a force. And then there were the rainy nights, when she walked alone through empty streets, the lamps casting long reflections upon wet stones. One imagines her footsteps echoing softly, the rhythm steady, her thoughts circling as endlessly as the raindrops around her. Did she walk towards something, or away from something? Was she searching, or simply drifting? No one could say, not even perhaps herself. These journeys gave her respite, yet they also deepened her sense of exile. She was always returning and departing, never anchored, always in motion. Hollywood expected her to return. Audiences demanded her presence, yet part of her longed to vanish entirely into the anonymity of foreign streets. It was in this tension between the world's hunger and her own desire to disappear that she lived, a figure both present and absent, seen and unseen. The rain dripped endlessly in Paris, each drop falling like a note in an unfinished song. And from that sound, another chapter began. The years when her greatest performances, drawn from literature and tragedy, reflected not only her art, but the sorrow of her wandering soul. The rain dripped steadily in Paris, each drop striking the stone as though marking time. And in that sound, her next chapter took shape. For it was in these years that Greta Garbo began to embody on screen the great tragic heroines of literature, women whose sorrows seemed to echo her own. As she walked beneath gray skies and through narrow streets, her inner solitude aligned with the destinies of Anna Karenina, of Marguerite Gautier, of Camille. The boundaries between actress and role blurred until audiences no longer knew where Garbo ended and her characters began. Anna Karenina came first, Tolstoy's doomed figure of passion and despair. Garbo stepped into the role with a gravity that seemed almost inevitable. Her eyes carried the weight of a woman torn between love and duty, between desire and the crushing laws of society. When she stood upon the train platform, her face filled with silent torment, the audience felt not a performance, but a confession. She seemed to draw upon her own hesitations, her own inability to surrender fully to love, her own fear of entrapment. The tragedy of Anna was not distant fiction. It was the reflection of Garbo's own struggle, played out in the flickering light of the screen. Then came Camille, the tale of Marguerite Gautier, the courtesan whose love is consumed by sacrifice and death. Garbo's performance was luminous, delicate, filled with the quiet dignity of a woman who knows her fate, yet faces it with grace. The scenes of illness, of fading strength, of love renounced for the sake of another, seemed to pierce audiences with unbearable poignancy. Many wept openly in theaters, believing they had glimpsed truth itself. Critics called it one of the greatest performances in cinema, and it remains so. Yet behind the art lay the question, was Garbo revealing herself, her own sorrow, her own resignation to solitude? Or was she simply a master of illusion? The ambiguity only deepened her legend. Her choice of roles was never careless. She resisted light comedies, declined parts that trivialized women, and sought instead those that carried weight, that spoke of longing and loss. Her heroines were women of passion, but also of restraint. Women who loved deeply yet suffered for it. Women whose solitude was as defining as their beauty. It was as if Garbo, in choosing these roles, was choosing to mirror herself, to reveal through fiction what she could never say aloud. Audiences across the world saw in her not merely an actress, but a symbol of the human condition itself, the ache of desire, the inevitability of loss, the dignity of suffering, born in silence. She gave shape to emotions too vast for words, and in this, she transcended the boundaries of performance. She became an icon, not only of cinema, but of longing itself, a figure whose face held the sorrow of an age. Yet this immersion in tragedy carried its own cost. To embody grief so fully, again and again, was to live within it. After the applause faded and the lights dimmed, Garbo returned to her solitude, carrying the residue of her character's sorrows with her. Friends noted that she often seemed weighed down after filming, as though the sadness she had portrayed lingered beyond the set. Perhaps art was not merely expression but also burden, a weight she bore silently in the dim rooms where she hid from the world. The public, however, saw only the brilliance. They spoke of her elegance, her haunting beauty, her ability to make silence itself eloquent. They applauded her. They adored her. They believed they knew her. Yet what they knew was not Garbo but the shadow of her roles, the reflection of her sorrow projected upon the screen. The real woman remained hidden, folded like the letters she never sent, retreating behind curtains, avoiding the eyes that sought her. Even in success, she seemed weary of it. She accepted the work, she gave herself to the roles, but fame itself remained distasteful. She longed, again and again, for escape, for walks in quiet cities, for the freedom to sit unrecognized in cafes, for the peace of solitude. Yet every performance bound her more tightly to the myth the world had created. The more she revealed on screen, the more she was pursued off it. The more she embodied tragedy, the more the world longed to glimpse her private sorrow. Her image was everywhere, yet her presence was rare. Photographs of her in gowns, her face lit by studio lights, filled magazines, while, in truth, she walked alone in shaded streets, her hat pulled low, her gaze averted. The distance between the woman and the image grew ever wider, and perhaps it was in that widening distance that her melancholy deepened. The applause that followed Camille echoed long after the final reel, but in her own quiet rooms, when the curtains were drawn and the world's noise had faded, she sat once more in silence. Perhaps she asked herself if the sorrow she portrayed was truly only art, or if it was the reflection of her own destiny. The sound of applause faded into the echo of her own heartbeat, steady, solitary, unresolved. And in that echo, whispers of another shadow began to form, the rumors of espionage, the suspicion that secrecy itself had become her second skin. The echo of her solitary heartbeat lingered in the silence, but outside her private rooms, the world itself was beating with a darker rhythm. The 30s slid into the 40s, and the shadow of war stretched across Europe. For Garbo, whose life was already defined by secrecy and silence, these years brought whispers that her solitude concealed more than melancholy, that behind her withdrawal she was quietly entangled in the currents of espionage and political intrigue. Rumors spread quickly, as rumors always did when her name was involved. Some said she had acted as an informant for British intelligence, passing along conversations overheard in the salons and drawing rooms of the powerful. Others claimed she had ties to Americans who watched the movements of Nazi sympathizers. Still others whispered that she had used her friendships with politicians and artists in Europe to gather knowledge, carrying fragments of information between continents. Whether these claims were true or not, the silence she maintained allowed them to thrive. For Garbo never explained, never confessed, never denied. Her circle of acquaintances during these years was indeed wide and unusual. She was known to have met leaders and thinkers, artists and aristocrats, men and women whose influence stretched across nations. She was seen in Paris, in London, in New York, speaking quietly in corners, listening more than she spoke. Those who watched from the outside could not help but imagine hidden purposes in her movements. Was she merely traveling, seeking escape as always, or was she carrying messages, offering observations, acting in service to causes she never acknowledged? Her very nature made the stories plausible. She was discreet, unapproachable, accustomed to silence. She moved easily between worlds, known everywhere yet accessible nowhere. If ever there was a figure suited to secrecy, it was Garbo. She had built her career upon mystery, and now the world imagined her mystery as part of a larger design. And yet no proof ever surfaced. Biographers would later chase the stories, unearthing fragments of letters, interviews, hints in intelligence archives. They found enough to suggest possibility, but not enough to confirm certainty. Like so much of her life, this chapter remains wrapped in ambiguity. Perhaps she did act quietly for the Allies, offering small services, providing fragments of knowledge. Perhaps she did nothing at all, merely living her solitude while others projected upon her the drama of the times. What cannot be denied is that the war years marked her deeply. She watched Europe fracture, cities she had walked in peace now shadowed by occupation and fear. Friends fled or vanished. Letters carried news of loss. For a woman who had always longed for retreat, the world offered no refuge. Her homeland of Sweden remained neutral, but neutrality itself was a fragile stance, shadowed by suspicion. In Paris, in London, in New York, the weight of history pressed upon her and perhaps deepened her instinct to remain hidden. Secrecy became not only protection, but necessity. She avoided statements, gave no interviews about the conflict, revealed nothing of her opinions. To some, this silence seemed indifference. To others, it was wisdom, a refusal to entangle her image in politics. Yet the rumors persisted, for silence invites speculation as surely as darkness invites shapes imagined in the shadows. Friends who knew her well spoke of her anxieties during these years, her fear for those caught in the war, her sadness at the devastation across Europe. She listened to the news with quiet intensity, her face unreadable, her thoughts hidden. Did she long to act, to do more than watch? Or did she believe that her only survival lay in remaining unseen? The questions circle endlessly, like whispers in a corridor where no voice ever answers. What is striking is how naturally the idea of espionage clung to her. She seemed made for secrecy. Her presence was unmistakable, yet she moved as though half invisible. Her words were few, her gestures subtle, her gaze unreadable. To imagine her passing unnoticed through a hotel lobby, listening quietly, carrying knowledge from one room to another, is to imagine only an extension of what she already was. Whether she actually did so is almost beside the point. The belief itself became part of her legend. And perhaps she understood this. Perhaps she let the rumors stand, knowing that denial would never erase them, and admission would trap her. Better always to remain silent, to allow the world to wonder, to believe what it wished. In that silence lay her freedom, even if it was a freedom heavy with solitude. When the war ended and Europe began the slow work of mending itself, Garbo returned to her chosen life of distance. She did not speak of what she had done or had not done. She offered no memoir, no interview, no explanation. The silence stretched, and within it the mystery grew. Those who longed for certainty were left unsatisfied, but for Garbo, uncertainty was the only truth she could ever fully inhabit. And so, as nations rebuilt and cities rose from ruins, she retreated again into her solitude, her legend carrying the weight of secrets never revealed. A coded telegram, a half-heard conversation, a rumor passed in a hotel corridor. These fragments became her biography, though she never claimed them. The telegram lies unanswered, its code unresolved, its message suspended in time. From that silence, another chapter emerges. The abrupt end of her career, the day she turned away from the screen at the height of her power and never returned. The telegram lay unanswered, its code unresolved, and perhaps it was a fitting image for what followed in Greta Garbo's life, for her next great act was itself a message without explanation. In 1941, at the height of her fame, with the world still eager for her presence, she stepped away from the screen and never returned. No farewell performance, no public declaration, no carefully staged curtain call. only absence. The silence she had always cultivated now became complete. The decision startled the world. Audiences who had wept through Camille, who had watched her eyes burn with longing in Anna Karenina, who had leaned forward to hear her low voice in Mata Hari and Queen Christina, suddenly found her gone. Critics puzzled, studio executives fretted, fans mourned. How could a woman at the pinnacle of her art desire to cross continents withdraw without warning? What reason could explain such a departure? Theories bloomed as they always did in the fertile soil of her silence. Some said she was weary of fame, suffocated by the endless gaze of the public. Others believed she was disillusioned with Hollywood itself, with the machinery that had consumed her youth and demanded her soul. Still others whispered of politics, of wartime anxieties, of connections too shadowed to name. And some, more practical, said she was simply tired, that the roles offered her no longer stirred her, that she preferred solitude to repetition. Garbo herself gave no clear answer. When pressed by those close to her, she replied only with fragments, hints of boredom, of dissatisfaction, of a desire to live outside the cage of performance. She spoke of freedom, of the wish to be left alone. But she never wrote a manifesto, never explained her motives in detail. Like so much of her life, the decision was wrapped in silence, leaving others to interpret what she chose never to say. The film that marked her departure was Two-Faced Woman. Critics found it unworthy of her, an awkward attempt at comedy that did not suit her gravitas. Some argue that the film's reception wounded her, convincing her that it was better to withdraw than to diminish her legend. Others believe she had already decided to leave, and the film was merely the final breath of a career she had chosen to end on her own terms. Whatever the truth, the effect was final. She did not return. In the years that followed, studios pleaded. Scripts were offered, fortunes promised, directors begged for her return. But Garbo declined them all. She vanished from the screen as suddenly as she had appeared, and in that vanishing, her legend grew even greater. For what is more powerful than the image of a star who walks away at her zenith, never allowing the world to see her fade? Her departure was not simply an ending, but a transformation. She ceased to be only an actress and became an enigma, a symbol of refusal, of distance, of the power of saying no. In a world where fame was pursued desperately, she rejected it. Where others clung to the screen, she abandoned it. Where many feared obscurity, she embraced it as a kind of freedom. And yet, freedom is never without cost. Having left Hollywood behind, Garbo settled into a quieter life, but the solitude that followed was not always gentle. She walked the streets of New York in later years, a solitary figure glimpsed by passers-by who could scarcely believe their eyes. She traveled, she read, she visited friends, but she never returned to the stage or screen. The woman who had embodied passion and tragedy for millions now lived in deliberate obscurity. What did she feel in those first years of absence? Relief, perhaps, to be free of the endless scrutiny, the constant demands, the artificial glamour, but perhaps also unease, for she had given her life to an art she now abandoned. Did she ever long for the lights again, for the gaze of the camera, for the applause of audiences unseen? Or did she find in her retreat the only peace she had ever truly known? The image of her walking away remains one of the great, unresolved gestures of cinema. It was as though she had stepped off stage mid-scene, leaving the play unfinished, the audience suspended. The curtain never fell, the applause never ended, and in that suspension, her myth was sealed. The stage stood empty, the curtains unmoving, the silence absolute. From that stillness rose the decades of solitude that followed, the long years when she walked the avenues of New York as a figure both present and ghostly, her legend preserved by absence alone. The stage stood empty. the curtains unmoving, and into that silence Greta Garbo carried herself away, not into obscurity but into a different kind of existence. She chose New York, a city vast enough to swallow even the most luminous of figures, a city where crowds moved like rivers and anonymity could be found in the press of footsteps on sidewalks. There, in an apartment overlooking the streets, she fashioned a life of solitude, far removed from the cameras that had once captured her every glance. Neighbors saw her from time to time, a tall figure in simple clothes, her face partly hidden beneath large sunglasses, her stride steady but unhurried. She walked through Central Park, alone yet not hurried, blending into the flow of joggers, mothers with strollers, couples hand in hand. To some, she was invisible, just another passerby. To others, she was instantly recognizable, though few dared to intrude. Those who did risk a word or a glance often found her silence intact, a curt nod at most, a quick step away into the crowd. The city itself seemed to suit her paradox. It was crowded yet impersonal, noisy yet filled with corners of quiet. In the hum of traffic and the murmur of voices, she could disappear, her presence diluted by the sheer immensity of life around her. She could be both present and absent, walking among thousands, yet belonging to none. For a woman who had spent years resisting exposure, this anonymity was its own form of sanctuary. Her days in New York followed no grand pattern. She rose late, walked often, read extensively. Books filled her apartment, their spines worn, their pages marked with notes. She favored biographies, histories, works of philosophy, as though she sought in words the explanations she denied in speech. She painted too, quietly, privately, though few ever saw her work. Friends who visited spoke of walls lined with canvases, modest but sincere, expressions of a solitude turned inward rather than projected onto the world. She entertained occasionally, but always sparingly, choosing companions with care. Conversations were quiet, often brief. She laughed at times, her humor sharp and unexpected, but she revealed little. She was not interested in recounting her past, nor in reviving her legend. To speak of Hollywood was, for her, to reopen a door she had closed forever. Those who tried found the subject quickly changed, the curtain drawn again. Photographers still sought her, and magazines printed the rare, grainy images of her striding through the city in a coat, her eyes shielded, her head turned away. These pictures, far from diminishing her aura, only deepened it. She was no longer the star dressed in jewels and gowns, but the solitary figure in ordinary clothes, the woman who had abandoned fame yet could never escape its shadow. To see her on a street corner was to glimpse a ghost, real, tangible, and yet belonging to another world. Decades passed in this rhythm, and Garbo remained steadfast in her withdrawal. Offers continued to arrive, scripts sent with desperate pleas, directors eager to tempt her back. She refused them all, sometimes without reply. Her silence was not negotiation, it was finality. She had chosen her path, and she held to it with the same discipline that had once shaped her art. Yet solitude, while chosen, was not always peaceful. Friends spoke of her moods, her spells of melancholy, her irritations with the noise of the world. She could be impatient, restless, critical of those around her. At times she seemed lonely, yearning for closeness, yet unwilling to surrender the independence that solitude gave. Visitors recalled her sudden withdrawals, evenings when she ended conversations abruptly, as though overwhelmed by the presence of others. She sought connection, but only on her terms, and those terms often narrowed to silence. Central Park bore witness to her persistence. She walked there year after year, her figure familiar to those who frequented its paths. She seemed to belong more to the trees and the open sky than to the city itself. There were mornings when the mist rose from the grass, when the air carried the scent of wet leaves, when she could vanish into the stillness of nature even in the heart of Manhattan. In those hours, perhaps she touched again the quiet of her Swedish childhood, the solitude she had carried from the beginning. And so her life became a paradox of visibility and invisibility. She was known everywhere, yet spoken to by few. Her name was immortal, yet her daily life was ordinary. She was sought by the world, yet she sought only to be left alone. To some, this retreat was tragic, a waste of brilliance. To others, it was an act of rare courage, a refusal to be consumed. For Garbo herself, it was simply her truth, the only way she could live without losing herself. The footsteps faded into the hum of city traffic, her figure disappearing around corners, her presence dissolving into crowds. And from those glimpses, another chapter arose. Encounters with the famous and the ordinary alike, rare moments when her absence was interrupted by sudden, fleeting presence, like a face glimpsed in a window and gone before one could be certain it was ever there. A face glimpsed in a window, gone before one could be certain it was ever there, became the measure of Greta Garbo's presence in her later years. She no longer appeared on screens, no longer stood before cameras, no longer gave the world performances to consume. And yet her absence was never complete. The myth endured not through appearances but through sightings, rare and fleeting, each retold like a story carried from mouth to mouth. To encounter her was to brush against a ghost, tangible, breathing, yet belonging to some other, unreachable realm. She was seen in cafes, often alone, sitting in a quiet corner, her face partly shielded by sunglasses even indoors. A waiter might whisper afterward that he had served her. A patron might claim to have caught her eye across the room. These stories multiplied, each small detail exaggerated into legend. The way she stirred her coffee, the way her silence filled the air around her, the way she rose suddenly and slipped out into the street before anyone dared to approach. To have seen her, even briefly, was to carry a secret memory, a fragment of mystery to be shared like treasure. Artists and writers were among those who encountered her, and their testimonies added weight to her myth. Pablo Picasso, it is said, once sought her out, fascinated by her face, by the aura of distance she carried. Other painters sketched her from memory, trying to capture what the world had been denied. Writers described her as a figure half in shadow, present yet unreachable. Each glimpse became not only a sighting of a woman, but a confirmation of an idea. The Garbo had transcended her life to become symbol, legend, essence. Even her neighbors in New York told stories. They saw her carrying groceries, walking the sidewalks, pausing to look in a shop window. Ordinary gestures, yet imbued with wonder, because they were hers. The contradiction was striking. She lived as any other, and yet to those who saw her, she was never ordinary. The aura she had built on screen clung to her, unshaken by the passing of years, unbroken by the ordinariness of daily tasks. Travel, too, brought glimpses. She visited Switzerland. She was seen in Capri. She wandered the streets of Paris again. In each place she was noticed, whispered about, pursued by the curious. Yet she never lingered, never gave herself fully. A brief appearance, a quick departure, always leaving behind the sense that she had been near but not touched. Sightings became like apparitions, sustaining her legend not through presence, but through absence glimpsed. What is remarkable is how these rare encounters kept her myth alive long after her retirement. Other stars faded, their fame dissolving as new faces appeared on screens. Garbo, by contrast, grew larger in absence. The fewer her appearances, the greater her aura. The less she was seen, the more she was remembered. The public denied her image, created it anew in imagination, each sighting feeding the hunger, each rumor expanding the legend. Those who spoke of her often remarked upon her stillness. Even in later years, her silence remained her language. She said little, offered little, but her presence was felt as deeply as ever. She seemed to carry an invisible barrier around her, a shield woven of solitude. To cross it was nearly impossible. To glimpse it was unforgettable. What must it have been like for her to live in this paradox? To shop for bread or sit in a cafe, knowing that each gesture might be transformed into legend? Did she grow weary of the whispers, or did she accept them as the price of the life she had chosen? Perhaps both. She longed for anonymity, yet her very retreat made her unforgettable. She wished to vanish, yet each sighting only confirmed her enduring presence. Friends who remained close to her described her as restless, often dissatisfied, quick to irritation, yet capable of warmth when she allowed it. They recalled dinners where she spoke little, then suddenly burst into laughter at some private joke. They remembered long silences broken by brief confessions, half-formed thoughts spoken only to be withdrawn again. She was never easy to know, even for those admitted into her inner circle. And perhaps that difficulty was part of her truth, that she herself did not wish to be known fully, not even by those she cared for. The sightings, the stories, the whispers, they sustained her legend, but also trapped her within it. She could never be ordinary, never be simply a woman walking down a street. She was always Garbo, even when she wished only to be Greta, a figure unseen. This tension haunted her, as it had throughout her life, and in later years it grew heavier, the solitude deepening into something darker. A face glimpsed in a window, then gone, remained the image of her life. Present but unreachable, real yet unreal, a mystery that endured not by revelation but by disappearance. And from that vanishing presence, another chapter emerged, the slow deepening of her reclusion, the way shadows lengthened around her as the years passed, until time itself seemed to fold her into silence. The shadows lengthened around her, not only in the rooms she kept dim with curtains, but in the slow passage of time itself. Greta Garbo, once the luminous figure upon whom audiences had projected their desires and sorrows, drifted further into a solitude that deepened with each year. The city outside her windows never ceased its movement. The taxis honking, the shouts of vendors, the restless hum of humanity. But within, she lived in a quieter rhythm, as though the world had receded to a distant echo. Friends noted that she grew more withdrawn as age pressed gently but relentlessly upon her. She walked the streets still, her tall frame recognizable even beneath heavy coats, but her pace slowed, and her eyes, hidden behind dark glasses, seemed turned inward more than ever. Central Park, once a refuge for her solitary strolls, became more difficult to navigate, yet she persisted, striding among the trees and benches as if reclaiming each step from the grasp of time. Melancholy lingered like an uninvited guest. She had always known solitude, had always chosen silence, but in later years, solitude thickened into something heavier. The laughter that had once surprised her friends appeared less often. Her sharp humor, though still present, was dulled by long silences, by irritations that flared easily, by a restlessness that could not be soothed. She seemed caught between yearning for companionship and resisting it, between longing for closeness and fearing the loss of herself within it. Those who tried to draw nearer often found her withdrawing again, closing the door before the bond could deepen. Her apartment, filled with books and paintings, became the stage of her final decades. She read voraciously, as if through the lives of others she might find what she had always resisted in her own. She painted with quiet diligence, canvases filled not with grandeur, but with personal reflection, colors carrying moods she rarely expressed in words. Visitors spoke of walls lined with her private creations, a silent dialogue between her solitude and her need to give it form. The telephone rang less often, letters arrived, but replies grew fewer. She answered only when she wished, and more often she did not. To some, this seemed sad, the loneliness of a woman who had once been adored by millions. To others, it was simply consistent with her truth, the fulfillment of the privacy she had pursued all her life. She had never belonged to the crowd, and now she belonged even less. And yet the world did not forget her. Journalists still sought her, though she offered no words. Photographers still tried to capture her, though she turned away. Occasionally, a blurred image appeared in print. A woman crossing a street, a bag of groceries in hand, a scarf wrapped around her hair. These pictures, ordinary in themselves, carried an aura of myth simply because they showed her. They were reminders that she was still alive, still walking among us, even as she seemed all ready to belong to memory. The whispers of melancholy grew louder. Neighbors spoke of her isolation, of days when she did not emerge from her apartment, of curtains that remained drawn. Some suggested she was haunted by regrets, by loves left unfinished, by the solitude she had chosen yet could never fully embrace. Others believed she was content in her own way, that she had built a fortress of privacy in which she could live without compromise. The truth, as always with Garbo, was elusive, suspended between contradiction and silence. Age became another shadow, soft but persistent. Lines appeared upon her face. Her body grew frailer. The vitality that had once filled the screen was tempered by time. Yet even as she aged, she carried herself with the same reserve, the same quiet dignity. She did not chase youth, did not seek to preserve the image of her prime. She let time mark her, as it marks all. But she did so in silence, refusing to allow the world to witness her transformation. She had given them her youth, her beauty, her gaze. She would not give them her decline. And so she lived year upon year, a figure of paradox, forgotten yet remembered, absent yet ever present, ordinary in her daily gestures, yet extraordinary in the weight of her legend. Those who glimpsed her in these later years spoke of the shock of recognition, the sense that they were seeing not merely a woman, but a myth, walking in flesh. Within her apartment, the clock ticked steadily, each hour marking both presence and absence. She did not speak of the past, nor of the future. She lived in the moment of her solitude, a moment that seemed endless, stretched across decades. Perhaps she found in this endurance a kind of peace, or perhaps it was only the persistence of habit, the continuation of a silence she had carried all her life. The clock ticked in the empty apartment, its sound unchanging, unyielding, a reminder that time itself cannot be silenced. And from that ticking, another moment approached, the quiet finality of her death in 1990, the simplicity of her farewell, and the world's mourning of a woman it never truly knew. The clock ticked steadily in the empty apartment, each moment marking the quiet erosion of time, until at last the hands came to rest. In April of 1990, Greta Garbo slipped away in New York City, her long solitude brought to a gentle end. She was 84 years old, a woman who had once been the most luminous figure of cinema, now leaving the world as quietly as she had lived within it. No grand farewell, no last interview, no orchestrated curtain call, only silence, the silence she had always chosen. The news moved quickly, carried by wires and newspapers, by television screens and radio voices. Around the world, people paused to remember, to wonder, to mourn. Some had not seen her face on screen for half a century, yet they remembered her still, as though time had not touched her legend. They spoke of her eyes, of her stillness, of the mystery that clung to her like a second skin. They spoke of her retreat, her solitude, her refusal to explain. And in their words there was both admiration and sorrow, for they grieved not only the passing of a woman, but the loss of an enigma that had haunted them for decades. Her funeral was simple, private, without spectacle. Those who gathered did so quietly, without cameras flashing, without the clamor of publicity. It was as if even in death she demanded the privacy she had protected in life. There were no rehearsed eulogies for the public, no grand tributes in gilded halls. Instead, the ceremony was marked by restraint, by dignity, by silence. The world beyond, however, roared with memory, with headlines and retrospectives, with images from her films replayed again and again. Soil fell softly upon wood, each sound a punctuation mark in the story of her life. It was not applause that followed her, but silence once more, the silence she had always carried. Those who loved her films remembered the tremor of her gaze, the echo of her voice, the sorrow of her heroines. Those who had known her personally remembered her reserve, her sudden laughter, her elusive presence, and yet no one could say with certainty who she truly was. She departed as she had lived, unspoken, unresolved, untouchable. The world grieved her absence, but in truth she had been absent for decades. Her retirement in 1941 had been a kind of death already, a vanishing from the screen that left only memory in its place. Yet memory had been enough. In her absence, she had become eternal. By leaving the stage at her peak, she had preserved herself in the amber of youth, forever luminous, forever enigmatic. Her actual aging, her solitary walks, her quiet years in New York, these were known only to a few. To most, she remained the woman on screen, frozen in black and white, gazing with eyes that seemed to pierce time itself. The paradox of her life sharpened in her death. She had refused to be known, and yet she was remembered everywhere. She had hidden herself, and yet she was seen by millions. She had retreated from fame, and yet she became its most enduring symbol. The world longed for answers, for revelations, for a glimpse behind the curtain, but Garbo gave none. Her silence outlived her voice. Her solitude outlasted her fame. She remained, even in death, the woman who had once said she wanted to be alone, and who had, in the end, achieved precisely that. What then was the meaning of her solitude? Was it freedom, the rare courage to live untouched by the world's hunger? Or was it exile, a sorrow she carried until the end? The question lingers, as unanswerable now as it was in her lifetime. Perhaps it is both, or perhaps it is neither. Perhaps she, herself, never knew. In the days that followed her passing, tributes filled newspapers and magazines. Writers called her the Sphinx of cinema, the eternal enigma, the face that haunted the 20th century. They spoke of her refusal to conform, her rejection of publicity, her ability to turn silence into art. They spoke of her loves, her retreats, her mysteries. But all these words, however eloquent, circled around a truth they could never enter. Garbo had kept her life hidden, and no obituary could unlock it. The soil closed over her resting place. The mourners departed, the world turned again, yet her presence remained, not in flesh but in memory, in reels of film still flickering in archives and on screens. To watch her was to feel again the pull of her mystery, to be drawn into her silence, to encounter the gaze that revealed everything and nothing. She was gone, yet she remained, suspended between reality and myth. The sound of soil falling upon wood faded into silence, and from that silence rose the final reflection, the question of whether solitude had been her choice or whether it had chosen her, shaping her life from the narrow streets of Stockholm to the quiet apartment in New York where the clock ticked its final hours. Was it she who chose solitude, or solitude that chose her? The question hovers in the silence she left behind, a silence deeper than words, wider than the decades that carried her from poverty in Stockholm to triumph in Hollywood and finally to the withdrawn rooms of New York. Perhaps the answer is unknowable, for Garbo herself never explained, never confessed, never allowed the world to hold her truths. What remains is not certainty but mystery, and perhaps that mystery is the truest reflection of her life. Her silence became her loudest voice. It was the language through which she shaped her art, the shield with which she guarded her soul, the paradox that made her unforgettable. In her silence on screen, audiences saw 1,000 emotions, unspoken yet felt. In her silence off screen, they imagined whole lives, whole romances, whole worlds. What she withheld became more powerful than anything she revealed. She proved that absence could be presence, that distance could be intimacy, that concealment could be revelation. To watch her still is to encounter not only an actress, but a question. Her gaze, preserved in black and white, carries a weight that seems timeless. It asks without asking, who am I? Who are you? What do we long for? And what do we fear? Her characters, Anna, Camille, Christina, are no longer simply roles but mirrors of ourselves, reflections of the longing and loss that define every human life. In her refusal to explain herself, she invited us to see our own uncertainties in her. And yet, behind the art, behind the myth, there was always the woman. Greta Lovisa Gustafsson, the laundress's daughter from Södermalm. She carried within her the silence of those early winters, the resilience of poverty, the reserve born of loss. That girl never vanished entirely, even as she was transformed into Garbo. Perhaps it was she who demanded the solitude, she who whispered through every role that the heart cannot be given lightly, that freedom must not be surrendered. The world saw only the star, but within her the child of Stockholm endured, carrying a quiet grief that no applause could erase. Her retreat from fame, so often viewed as abandonment, may instead be her greatest act of creation. By leaving the screen at her height, she ensured that her image would never fade, that her presence would remain suspended in timelessness. She denied the world her decline and gave it instead her eternal enigma. In this sense, her solitude was not only personal, but artistic, a decision to shape her legend as carefully as she had once shaped her roles. She became the rarest of figures, one who grew greater by disappearing. The world mourned her absence, but in mourning, they gave her permanence. She remains even now a figure glimpsed but not known, a voice heard yet still secret, a face luminous yet untouchable. To think of Garbo is to think of distance, a closed curtain, a folded letter, a door half shut. But within that distance lies intimacy of another kind, the intimacy of mystery, which binds us more deeply than revelation ever could. Her life, filled with contradictions, leaves us not with answers, but with images. A girl walking through snow-dusted streets of Stockholm, her breath rising in the cold. A young woman standing silent on a Hollywood set, her eyes carrying the weight of entire worlds. A figure slipping through the rainy streets of Paris, vanishing before one can follow. A solitary walker in Central Park wrapped in a coat, her face hidden, her stride steady. An old woman sitting in a quiet New York apartment, reading, painting, listening to the steady ticking of the clock. Each image remains unresolved, like scenes from a film without final act, and in their incompleteness lies their power. Perhaps that is the essence of Garbo. She never allowed her life to become a closed story. She resisted endings, resisted clarity, resisted the tidy explanations the world so often demands. She remained instead an unfinished sentence, a half-spoken word, an echo fading into silence. In her refusal, she gave us not certainty but wonder, not closure but longing. And so, when we speak of her today, we do not speak only of an actress or even of a star. We speak of a presence that transcended its own time, a woman who became the embodiment of mystery itself. She showed us that silence can speak, that absence can endure, that the most powerful truths may be those left unsaid. She remains, in her solitude, eternal. The curtain never rises again. The theater is dark, the stage bare, the reels still. Yet in the silence her image lingers, her eyes gazing across time, asking questions that have no answer. Greta Garbo remains forever, the woman who withheld herself, and in that withholding gave more than any could have imagined.